They say a mother's heart always knows when something is about to break. That morning mine did. The sun had barely touched the curtains when I felt it, a heaviness I couldn't explain. I was making tea the same way I had for years when my phone buzzed on the counter. One message. One moment. That was all it took. I wiped my hands and picked up the phone. When I saw the name, my chest warmed. Daniel. My son. My pride. My only family left. It had been over a week since I heard from him. I smiled before I even opened it, imagining a "good morning, Mom," or "how are you doing?" But it wasn't that. The message said, "Mom, you weren't invited to dinner tonight. Sophie doesn't feel comfortable. I hope you understand." I read it once, then again, and again. Every time it cut deeper. For a few seconds, I just stood there, still, cold, unable to move. Then came another message. "It's just a small dinner with Sophie's parents. She wants it to be family only. I'll call you later. Family only." My breath caught. My hands shook so much I nearly dropped the phone. The house around me felt bigger, emptier. The sound of the clock ticking suddenly grew louder, sharper, crueler. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at my cup of tea until it turned cold. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was simply invisible. Daniel was my entire world. When his father passed away, I poured everything I had into raising him right. He was gentle, polite, soft-spoken. He used to hold my hand whenever we crossed the street, even as a teenager. When he met Sophie, I was genuinely happy for him. She was everything Daniel wasn't. Confident, charming, full of energy. She had that kind of smile that made everyone like her. Everyone but me, though I couldn't explain why. It wasn't hatred, it was instinct. Something about her kindness felt measured, like every word had a price tag. At first I ignored it. Love makes people blind, and mothers forgive even what they shouldn't. But slowly, after the wedding, things started to change. Daniel's calls became shorter, our visits less frequent. And whenever I did come by, Sophie would smile, that polite, distant smile, and say things like, "Oh, you didn't have to come all this way," or "Daniel's been so busy lately." Her words were sweet, but her eyes said something else. And Daniel, he started looking at her before he answered me. That was when I realized something. You don't lose your child in one moment. You lose them piece by piece. I still remember the first time she asked me not to bring food anymore. She said, "Evelyn, you don't have to trouble yourself." Daniel's watching his diet. Daniel loved my cooking. He always had. But I just nodded and smiled. Because that's what mothers do. We adjust, we step back, we love quietly. So when that text came, "You weren't invited," I shouldn't have been surprised. But I was. Because no matter how strong you are, nothing prepares you for the moment your child chooses someone else's comfort over your love. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I put the phone down, folded my hands, and whispered to no one. I raised a good man. He'll remember who he is. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to. How do you answer a message that breaks your heart and asks you to understand it? Hours passed. I sat at the same table, watching daylight fade into evening. I thought about all the years Daniel and I had shared. His first day at school, his nervous laugh before graduation, his voice trembling when he told me about Sophie. And now, silence. It's strange how life can turn so quickly. One day, you're the center of your child's world. The next, you're the reason his wife feels uncomfortable. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was overreacting. But when night fell, I still hadn't moved from that chair. For the first time, I felt old. Not in my body, but in my heart. I thought of calling him just once to hear his voice. But I knew if I did, I'd sound desperate. And I didn't want pity. I wanted respect. So I sat there, quiet, replaying every memory that brought us here. And underneath the sadness, a calm feeling began to rise. Not anger, not revenge. Something deeper. The quiet certainty that truth always finds its way. Before going to bed, I looked at my reflection in the window. My face looked tired, but my eyes, they still had something left in them. "I'll stay silent," I whispered. "But not forever." Then I turned off the lights. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about those words on my phone, glowing in the dark like a scar that wouldn't fade. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Because a mother doesn't need an invitation to love her child. And sometimes, silence is the only answer strong enough to be heard. When Daniel married Sophie, I thought it would be a new chapter full of happiness. I imagined family dinners, laughter echoing through the house, and the little things that make life feel whole. Birthdays, Sunday breakfasts, small stories shared over coffee. But life has a way of changing quietly, almost invisibly. At first, it was little things. Phone calls that used to last for hours were now just a few words. "I'm busy," or "we'll talk later." Visits that once filled my home with warmth became rare and awkward. And when I did come by, Sophie's polite smile always seemed a little too measured, a little too careful, like she was testing every word I spoke before letting it reach Daniel. I tried not to notice. I told myself it was just adjustment. New marriages are always delicate. But slowly, the warmth that had defined our family began to fade, replaced with subtle coldness I couldn't ignore. Daniel, my son, my heart began changing too. He still smiled at me, still hugged me when I arrived, but it was different now. There was a hesitation I couldn't place, a quiet restraint in his eyes. He had always been gentle and considerate, but now I often caught him glancing at Sophie, waiting for her cue before responding to me. He was caught between loyalty to his wife and the bond we had shared his entire life, and I could see the weight of it on his shoulders. Sophie was careful, always polite, but her control over him was subtle. It wasn't in the loud, obvious ways. There were no arguments, no sharp words. Instead, it was in the small things. Her suggestions that Daniel cancel his calls with me, her hints that certain topics were off limits, the way she rearranged plans without considering my feelings. I wasn't allowed to feel like a part of their life anymore, at least not the way I had been. I remember a Sunday afternoon not long after their wedding. Daniel had called me sounding hesitant. "Mom," he said, "Sophie thinks it's better if we have dinner at her parents' house tonight. Can we reschedule ours?" Reschedule ours. Those words stung in a way that wasn't obvious at the time. That day, the warmth of our regular Sunday dinners, the laughter of his childhood, the comfort of watching him eat the food I had prepared, all of it was gone. I nodded, of course. I didn't complain. I smiled and said, "Of course, darling. I understand." Inside, though, something cracked. I could feel the distance growing, stretching slowly between us like an invisible wall. And no matter how much I tried to reach him, it seemed like every attempt pushed him a little further away. I found myself replaying memories, trying to pinpoint the moment things had shifted. I remembered when he was little, holding my hand tightly as we walked to school, and he had whispered, "Mom, I'm never leaving you." I remembered his first day at college, how he called me every night to tell me about his day. I remembered birthdays, graduations, quiet nights when he just sat beside me talking about dreams. And now, he barely looked at me. He barely spoke. He was here but not here. The strangest part was that I couldn't bring myself to be angry. Not really. I felt hurt, yes, a quiet, deep ache, but it was mixed with confusion. Had I done something wrong? Was I too involved? Had I somehow failed to notice the subtle tension building around us? Sophie, for all her charm, had started to define the boundaries of their marriage, and I, who had once been central to Daniel's life, was becoming peripheral. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fights, no harsh words. It was just absence. I would call, and he would be busy. I would visit, and Sophie would make small excuses why we couldn't spend time together. And Daniel, ever polite, ever kind, would apologize, always softly, always hesitantly. His love for me hadn't disappeared. I knew that deep down. But it was tangled with obligation, with pressure, with a careful weighing of whose feelings mattered most in each moment. Sometimes late at night, I would sit alone in my living room, holding a cup of tea, staring at the dark window, and think about those early years. When Daniel was little, he would come to me with scraped knees, his hands sticky from chocolate, his laughter filling the room. He had always needed me, and I had always been there. And now I needed him. Not for validation, not for comfort, but simply to feel the connection we once shared. And he seemed so far away. That quiet ache became a constant companion. Every family event, every holiday, every simple interaction reminded me of the distance. The moments I had once taken for granted, casual hugs, small talks about nothing and everything, were now precious memories, like glimpses of a world I no longer fully belonged to. I didn't know when the gap had become a canyon. I only knew that one text, that single message from Daniel about not being invited, confirmed what I had feared all along. The warmth had gone, replaced with polite distance. And yet, beneath the pain, a quiet resolve began to grow, because even when love seems forgotten, even when the people you hold closest drift away, something in you remembers, something in you waits, something in you prepares. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how or when I would confront this growing distance. But one thing I knew clearly: the bond between a mother and her child doesn't vanish easily. It may bend, it may stretch, but it can endure more than anyone imagines. And I would endure too. That evening, as I sat quietly, thinking about Daniel and Sophie and the life they were building, I realized that love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was silent. Sometimes it was patience. Sometimes it was waiting for the right moment to be seen and acknowledged, not with anger, but with truth. And that moment had not yet come. It wasn't one single moment that made me realize how far the distance had grown between Daniel and me. It was the little things, the whispers behind closed doors, the subtle shifts in behavior that I couldn't ignore anymore. The phone calls I used to count on, calls that could last for hours, were now short, clipped. I would call him, hoping to hear his voice, and often he wouldn't answer. Sometimes he would return the call days later, apologizing softly. "Sorry, Mom, I've been busy." But the warmth in his tone that used to wrap around me like a hug was gone. There was hesitation, an almost imperceptible restraint, as if he had to measure every word, every pause, before speaking. Visits became another minefield. The door would open, Sophie greeting me with that same careful smile. Polite, seemingly kind, but the kind of kindness that always felt rehearsed. "Oh, Evelyn, it's so nice to see you," she would say. And yet, her eyes told a different story. There was tension there, a quiet warning. The kind of warning that meant some things weren't mine to say or touch. I noticed the subtle rules she imposed on our interactions. Questions about Daniel's plans often met with a faintly disapproving tilt of the head. Small comments on home decor dismissed as irrelevant. Even my attempts to engage in family conversation were occasionally redirected by Sophie's gentle, almost imperceptible interruptions. It wasn't anger. It wasn't cruelty. It was control, wrapped in politeness, so carefully that it almost disguised itself as civility. Daniel was caught in the middle. I could see it in his eyes every time I visited. He loved me. I never doubted that. But he also loved Sophie, and the loyalty he felt toward her had begun to reshape him in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was guilt in the way he looked at me when Sophie made those small, sharp comments. There was hesitation in the way he chose his words, as if he had to weigh them against an invisible scale, my feelings on one side, Sophie's on the other. And I hated that scale. I hated it because it forced my son to measure love with caution, to ration affection as if it were a currency. I hated it because it reminded me that the closeness we once shared was slipping further from my reach, little by little, day by day. I began noticing other signs, too. Invitations I never received, though they had gone out to neighbors or distant relatives. Plans canceled at the last minute, often with an explanation that sounded reasonable, polite, and impossible to argue against. Daniel's subtle avoidance of any conversation that might reveal my feelings or test the fragile peace between him and his wife. And all the while, Sophie's calm, measured voice floated over every interaction. "Daniel, maybe we should—" "Evelyn, I think it would be better if—" Her words always had that soft, convincing tone, but underneath, there was a current of command. I could feel it even if no one else did. One evening, I tried to reach Daniel about an old family matter. It was trivial, really. A question about a recipe, something he had always loved. I called him 3 times, no answer. Finally, late at night, he returned the call. His voice was quiet, nervous, almost apologetic. "Mom, I can't talk right now. Sophie's around and she doesn't want me distracted. I'll call tomorrow." Tomorrow came and went, and I realized painfully that busy had become their shield. Busy was a wall built between us, polite and impenetrable. It was then I understood the whispers behind closed doors. They weren't literal whispers. They were small gestures, missed calls, polite refusals, redirections, hints that something had shifted, a private script that I wasn't part of anymore. And Daniel, my son, didn't know how to break free from it. He didn't want to hurt me. He didn't want to fight with Sophie. So he walked carefully, speaking cautiously, trying to honor 2 loves at once, and in doing so, he drifted further from both. I felt a quiet, aching helplessness. I wanted to call out, to demand attention, to make him see me as he once had. But I couldn't, not yet. Because love, I realized, isn't just about presence. Sometimes it's about endurance. That night, I sat alone in the dim light, thinking of all the afternoons we had shared, homework at the kitchen table, walks to the park, bedtime stories, memories that had been simple, ordinary, yet so full of closeness. And now each memory was tinged with sorrow. I understood finally how distance doesn't always announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly, with unanswered calls, canceled plans, and polite words that cut deeper than arguments ever could. But beneath the sorrow, something else stirred. Not anger, not bitterness, a calm awareness that this was not the end. That even through walls built quietly and cleverly, truth and love had a way of reaching through. And I would wait. I would endure. And when the moment came, I would be seen. It started like any other evening, ordinary in its quietness. I had been hoping for a call, a message, anything that might signal that Daniel remembered me, that he still wanted me around. I had heard from Sophie that they were hosting a small family dinner. My heart clutched with anticipation, a mixture of hope and fear. I waited, glancing at my phone every few minutes, telling myself, maybe they'll remember me. Maybe they've saved a spot. But as the clock inched forward, no message came. Just the silence, heavy and tense, filling the spaces where warmth had once lived. And then it arrived, the text that would crack open everything I had held inside. "Mom, you weren't invited. Sophie doesn't feel comfortable." I stared at the screen, disbelief freezing me in place. My hands shook as if the phone itself had betrayed me. My chest felt tight, the familiar ache of heartbreak settling in like an unwelcome guest. Not invited. Those words repeated themselves in my mind over and over. Not invited. Not invited. Not invited. The world around me blurred. I saw flashes of Daniel as a little boy, his chubby hands clutched in mine as he ran to the playground, his laughter filling the air. I remembered teaching him to tie his shoes, the long nights he spent struggling with homework while I sat beside him, patient and encouraging. I remembered every scraped knee, every fever, every whispered, "Mom, I'm scared." And now, after all those years, I wasn't allowed to share a table with the man he had become. I wasn't allowed to witness the small joys of his married life. I sank into a chair, phone still in hand, and let the quiet wash over me. Silence, I realized, could be louder than any insult. Louder than anger, louder than fighting, louder even than heartbreak itself. I thought about all the dinners we had shared when Daniel was growing up. Me chopping vegetables, him stirring something in the pot, laughter bouncing off the walls. Those moments, ordinary then, now seemed sacred in memory. And Sophie. Sophie had decided I didn't belong there anymore. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the nights I stayed awake watching him sleep when he was sick, the hours I spent teaching him to ride his bike, even when my knees ached, the times I held him close when he was sad, telling him he was strong enough to face the world. I gave him everything I had, every ounce of my love, every piece of my heart, and now, not even a seat at his table. My mind wandered to the first time Daniel brought Sophie home. She smiled, polite and bright, but there was a distance in her eyes I couldn't quite place. At first I thought it was nerves. Then it became habit. Each visit, each interaction subtly reshaped the space between us. And now that space had grown wide enough to keep me out entirely. I didn't shout. I didn't storm their house. I just sat there, absorbing the quiet devastation that came with that simple message. It wasn't just the exclusion. It was the realization that my son, the boy who once needed me for everything, had allowed someone else to decide where I belonged. And in the stillness, I whispered to myself, I gave him everything. And now, not even a seat at his table. Those words echoed like a heartbeat in the empty room. And yet, beneath the pain, something else stirred, a quiet resolve. I would not disappear entirely. I would not beg for inclusion, but I would not remain powerless either. There would come a time when the truth of love, loyalty, and patience would be seen. And when that time came, it would be undeniable. For now, all I could do was breathe, remember, and let the heartbreak settle into the part of me that grows stronger with each challenge. Because sometimes, being uninvited is not a sign of defeat. Sometimes it is simply the moment when strength begins to awaken. The message lingered in my mind long after I put the phone down. Not invited. Sophie doesn't feel comfortable. Those words played over and over, looping in a rhythm that refused to stop. I felt a storm inside me, a turbulence I couldn't name at first. Anger, heartbreak, shame, perhaps all of them tangled together. My chest felt heavy, as if every memory of raising Daniel, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, had been quietly weighed and found. Insufficient. I wanted to call him. I wanted to beg. I wanted to storm through their front door and demand the truth. But I didn't. I sat in my living room, staring at the walls that had witnessed a lifetime of love and care. Pride and pain wrestled inside me. I had taught Daniel right from wrong, nurtured his dreams, celebrated his victories, and comforted his failures. Could I now let him, could I allow anyone to erase that history with a few polite words? I realized then that silence was my shield. I would not let this moment break me. I would not let the absence of an invitation define me. Friends noticed my quiet demeanor. Some tried to help, offering advice that was gentle, practical, but not always easy to hear. Evelyn, my neighbor, whispered one afternoon, maybe just let it go. Don't show up. They'll see you anyway when they're ready. Another, slightly braver, said, sometimes the best way to teach them a lesson is to step back. Let them realize what they've done. I heard them, nodded politely, and thanked them for their wisdom. But inside, I was already thinking beyond their words. I was no longer just a mother reacting. I was a mother observing, calculating, quietly gathering the strength to act. Not rashly, not in anger, but with intention. The storm inside me began to settle into something else. Not surrender, not defeat, but clarity. I realized that patience could be a weapon more powerful than any argument. Calm could be more disarming than confrontation. I began to notice small details I hadn't before. Sophie's subtle attempts to control the room, the way Daniel flinched when she made a suggestion, the tension she carried under her polite smile. These observations weren't sources of despair anymore. They were pieces of a puzzle, waiting to be understood. And I understood that my response didn't have to be loud. It didn't have to be dramatic. It could be quiet, calculated, precise. It could be me showing up. Not broken, not desperate, but unwavering, dignified, and undeniably present. That night, I sat in the dim light of my living room, thinking about what I would do. I imagined the dinner, the guests, the polite chaos of their little gathering. I imagined Sophie's smile faltering when truth quietly made its presence known. I imagined Daniel realizing without words that his mother had been here all along, steady, composed, and in control of her own dignity. A calm determination began to replace the storm. The pain was still there, and of course it was, but it no longer consumed me. It had become fuel for the quiet, deliberate plan that was beginning to take shape inside me. I didn't yet know the exact moment I would act, or how it would unfold. But I knew this. When the time came, I would not stumble. I would not plead. I would not beg. I would simply arrive, and the truth of who I was and what I had given Daniel would speak louder than any argument ever could. I leaned back in my chair and let the storm settle fully. In its place was a steady pulse of strength, calm, measured, unwavering. I was not defeated. I was not invisible, and I would not allow myself to be forgotten at the table of my own child. The quiet plan had begun. The next morning, I was still carrying the quiet storm from the night before. My thoughts were tangled in memories of Daniel's childhood, Sophie's subtle walls, and the message that had left me feeling invisible. I was sipping my tea when the phone rang. It was Lily, my granddaughter, my little sunshine in the midst of this shadowed world. She was only 8, but her voice could melt any tension, any pain. "Grandma!" she exclaimed, her tone bubbling with excitement. "We're having dinner tonight. You should come." My heart skipped. I froze. "Lily," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "I mean it," she interrupted, earnest and sincere. "It'll be fun." Mom didn't say anything. "But I really want you to come." Her innocence was like a tiny lifeline. She didn't know about Sophie's unspoken rules. She didn't know about the text about being uninvited. All she knew was that she wanted her grandma at the table. I sat back in my chair, my hands trembling slightly. This was the moment. The choice. The silent test I had been preparing for in my mind all these weeks. Should I go? Every rational part of me whispered caution. Sophie didn't want me there. Daniel had asked me to respect that. Showing up might create conflict, embarrassment, tension. Maybe I should just stay home, let the invitation go, and preserve whatever fragile peace existed. But another, louder part of me, the part that remembered every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every story shared in whispers at bedtime, said no. Lily didn't care about rules. Lily didn't know about polite exclusions. She only knew love, and I couldn't ignore that. I closed my eyes and thought about Daniel as a boy, his first steps, his birthday candles, the way he'd run to me with scraped knees or a triumphant grin after a small victory. I had been there for everything. I had given him all of me. And now his daughter, my granddaughter, was asking me to be part of something simple and pure, a family dinner. How could I say no? I picked up the phone, my voice calm but firm. "Lily," I said softly, "Grandma will come tonight. I wouldn't miss it for the world." There was a pause on the other end, and then the joy in her voice burst out like sunlight. "Yay, you're coming! I can't wait!" And just like that, the decision was made. But I knew this wasn't about making a scene. I wasn't going to arrive with drama or confrontation. I wasn't going to argue about invitations or exclusions. This wasn't about proving anything to Sophie. This was about being present, quietly, firmly, and lovingly, for my family, for Lily, for the truth that could not be erased by polite distance or calculated politeness. I would go. I would sit at that table. And I would do it with dignity. Because some bonds can't be denied. Some love can't be ignored. And some mothers simply show up when it matters most. The evening air was cool, almost still, as I stepped out of my house. I carried nothing but a small dish of the food Daniel had always loved, something I had made quietly, carefully, with the same hands that had prepared countless meals for him over the years. Each step toward their door felt heavier than the last. My heart thumped not with fear, but with anticipation. Anticipation of a moment I had imagined countless times. A moment where I would show up, not as a guest seeking approval, but as a mother who had loved fully, quietly, unwaveringly. The neighborhood lights blurred past as I walked. I rehearsed my posture, my smile, the calmness I intended to carry. I would not cry. I would not plead. I would not beg for acknowledgement. I would simply arrive and let the truth of my presence speak for itself. When I reached the front door, I paused. A deep breath. One hand rested lightly on the doorknob. And then I entered. The room fell into a subtle tension I could feel instantly. Sophie, standing near the kitchen counter, froze mid-motion. Her polite smile faltered just for a second as her eyes registered me. Shock, confusion. That careful composure she always wore like armor suddenly wavered. Daniel turned toward me, his eyes wide, his hands slightly trembling. He had not expected me to come. And yet there I was, quiet, poised, and completely undeterred. I offered my small dish. "I made this for dinner," I said softly, my voice calm. "I thought Daniel might like it." The room was silent, save for the subtle clinking of silverware and the hum of the oven. Sophie tried to smile, but it was a strained effort. Daniel swallowed nervously, caught between guilt, relief, and the lingering tension of Sophie's presence. I didn't speak further. I didn't explain. I didn't demand a seat. I simply set the dish on the table, keeping my hands steady, my back straight, and my gaze gentle yet unwavering. There is power in silence. There is authority in composure. And in that moment, I understood fully how a quiet presence can speak louder than any argument, louder than any confrontation. As I looked around, I noticed the subtle cracks in the carefully built walls. Sophie's eyes flickered with unease. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension in his jaw easing, as if he finally realized that some bonds cannot be erased by polite rules or quiet control. I moved gracefully to my seat, nodded at Daniel, and smiled at Lily, who bounced with excitement. Her pure joy filled the space in a way that no tension, no polite pretense could ever diminish. And in that room, amid polite hesitation and unspoken words, I felt a quiet victory. Not because I had confronted anyone, not because I had claimed a seat at the table, but because I had remained myself, dignified, steady, and unbroken. I realized then that a mother's love is not loud or demanding. It is patient. It is enduring. It is steady in the face of discomfort and composed in the face of exclusion. The night I showed up, I did not need to speak much. The very act of being there, the very act of holding my head high and offering love quietly, made the difference. I did not arrive to argue. I arrived to exist, to remind my son, to remind myself that some truths and some bonds cannot be denied. And in the power of that silence, I found my peace. Dinner began like any other family meal, polite and orderly, but I could feel the undercurrents immediately. Sophie's smile was sharp, her gestures precise, every word carefully measured. I could see the tension she tried so hard to hide, the slight flicker in her eyes whenever Daniel looked at me, or Lily laughed at something I said. The other guests, Daniel's in-laws and a few family friends, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Polite curiosity, mild confusion, the faintest recognition that something was off. Lily, blissfully unaware of adult dynamics, was her usual bright self. She chattered endlessly, telling stories about school, her friends, and her day's little adventures. And then, as she often did, she spoke without filtering, saying things exactly as they were. "Grandma," she said, her face innocent, "Mom said you weren't supposed to come tonight because you make Dad upset." The words landed like stones in still water. The room stilled for a heartbeat. Sophie's fork paused midair, her eyes widening imperceptibly. Daniel's gaze flickered between his wife and me, guilt written across his face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand an apology. I simply smiled softly and set my hand gently over Lily's. "That's okay, darling," I said quietly. Sometimes adults forget that children see things very clearly. Then I began a small story, one that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried its own weight of truth. "Do you all remember," I started years ago when Daniel was little, "how he once built a tiny tower of blocks? He worked on it for hours, trying to make it perfect. And then someone came along and told him it wasn't good enough. But he kept building, and eventually, he made something stronger than he could have imagined at first. That little boy never stopped believing in himself, no matter what anyone said." I let the words hang there. No accusations, no confrontations, just a gentle reminder that Daniel had been nurtured with care, that his foundation had been built with love and patience, and that no one could erase that. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The polite mask she wore slipped ever so slightly, revealing the tension beneath. She tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, offering suggestions for dessert and commenting on the weather, but the shift had already occurred. The truth had a way of finding its voice, even when mine was quiet. Daniel's guilt became palpable. His hands clenched subtly beneath the table. He wanted to defend me, to explain, to say that Sophie hadn't meant it that way. But the words caught in his throat. He realized in that moment that his mother had been excluded unfairly, and he could no longer ignore it. The other guests noticed the awkwardness now, the invisible lines of tension Sophie had tried to control. Questions were asked, small remarks dropped, gentle observations, but enough to make the atmosphere heavy with unspoken understanding. And I remained calm. I didn't argue. I didn't lecture. I didn't even look directly at Sophie. I simply told my story, smiled at Lily, and let the quiet power of truth speak through me. By the end of the meal, the air had changed. Sophie's careful politeness now felt brittle, forced, and everyone, Daniel included, could sense it. The walls she had tried so hard to build around herself had cracks, and those cracks let the light in. Daniel reached over to squeeze my hand beneath the table. His eyes told me everything: regret, love, and the recognition that I had remained steady, composed, and dignified, even in the face of exclusion. That night the truth did not shout. It did not need to. It simply rested at the table, heavy and undeniable, and everyone felt its weight. And in that weight I found a quiet sense of vindication, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through the unwavering presence of a mother who had refused to be erased. The room was tense, the quiet weight of truth hanging over every conversation. Sophie tried to regain control, to restore the polite composure she had always worn so carefully. "I just didn't want to make things awkward," she said, her voice tight, almost defensive. I thought it would be easier if her words faltered. Her carefully constructed mask cracked. The confidence she had projected so flawlessly began to crumble, revealing insecurity she had hidden beneath layers of politeness. She tried to redirect the conversation, to laugh off the tension, but the room felt different now. Guests exchanged glances, sensing the shift. Daniel's hands fell to the table. He was silent at first, but I could see the storm brewing in his eyes. He had tried to juggle love for his wife and loyalty to me, but the balance had finally collapsed. Mom," he whispered, voice trembling. I didn't see." The words choked him. Tears welled up, unspoken apologies hanging in the air between us. He realized, finally, the quiet hurt he had allowed to build, the distance he had permitted, and the exclusion that had cut deeper than any argument could. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice. I did not confront. I simply sat, calm and collected, letting the truth exist in the space we shared. My hands rested lightly on my lap, my posture composed, my gaze gentle. There was no anger, no shouting, only presence, only the steady, unwavering strength of someone who had loved fully, given fully, and endured quietly. Sophie's insecurities spilled out in fragments. I thought, I didn't. And in each fragment, Daniel saw what I had seen for weeks, that control and politeness were not strength, but fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of losing the narrative she had tried so carefully to shape. Daniel's shoulders slumped, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. He looked at me, and in that glance there was recognition. Recognition of everything I had given, everything I had endured, and everything I still carried with grace. I took a deep breath, standing slowly. I gathered my dish from the table, smiling gently at Lily. "Thank you for letting me share dinner with you, darling," I said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then quietly, I walked to the door. No drama, no arguments, no ultimatums. Just a mother leaving with dignity, leaving behind a room heavy with truth. A room where lies, insecurities, and polite manipulations had been revealed by the simple power of calm presence. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt something settle inside me. Relief, yes, but also a quiet pride. I had shown up. I had been seen. And I had allowed the truth to exist without raising my voice. Some lessons don't need shouting. Some victories are measured not in confrontation, but in grace. And tonight, That grace spoke louder than any words ever could. Days passed after that evening, and the quiet that followed felt almost sacred. I went about my routine, carrying with me the peace of knowing I had remained composed, dignified, and true to myself. The storm inside me had finally settled into something steady, a calm that no text, no exclusion, no polite manipulation could shake. And then, one afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Daniel standing there, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands trembling slightly. He looked older than his years, weighed down not by time, but by the realization of what he had allowed to happen between us. "Mom," he began, voice thick with emotion. I need to apologize. I didn't see it. I didn't understand how much it hurt you, how much I hurt you by letting things go this far." I studied him for a moment. I saw his guilt, his regret, and the love that had never truly faded. I didn't speak immediately. I let him feel the gravity of the silence, the same silence I had carried with me at the dinner table. "I'm sorry, Mom," he repeated. "I should have noticed. I should have protected you, not let anyone push you away." Sophie, when Daniel mentioned her later, was humbled. The polite armor she had worn so carefully was now visibly cracked. Her distance spoke volumes. No dramatic confrontation, no outburst, just the quiet realization that her control had failed and that the truth, ever patient, had found its way. I forgave them, not because they necessarily deserved it, but because forgiveness was my freedom. Holding on to anger or resentment would have chained me to the past. Peace, I realized, could only be found in letting go and allowing the truth to breathe. I reached out, pulling Daniel into a hug. No words were needed beyond the soft, steady beat of our hearts reconnecting. Lily ran into the room, beaming, oblivious to the previous tension, and wrapped her small arms around both of us. In that moment, all the distance, all the polite exclusions, all the unspoken frustrations melted away. Later, as I sat alone reflecting on the journey, I realized something profound. Sometimes you don't need to fight for respect. You don't need to argue, to shout, or to demand recognition. You just have to show up and let truth take your seat at the table. And in showing up, I had not only reminded my family who I was, but I had reminded myself dignity, patience, and quiet strength often speak louder than words. Some victories are silent, some lessons are subtle, but the impact? That lingers forever. And as I watched the sun set that evening, casting golden light across the room, I knew this. Even in the absence of loud words or dramatic gestures, love and truth will always find their place. As I sit here, reflecting on the events of the past days, I realize how much life teaches us in ways we don't always expect. Pain can come quietly, wrapped in words left unsent, invitations withheld, or polite smiles that hide distance. And yet, strength often grows in silence, in patience, and in the quiet choices we make. I have learned that dignity is not something given by others. It is something we carry within ourselves. It is not loud, it is not demanding. It is steady, composed, and unyielding. A quiet force that no exclusion, no manipulation, and no temporary walls can ever erase. Patience, too, has a power all its own. Waiting, observing, and choosing the right moment to act allows truth to reveal itself naturally. The impact of presence, of showing up when it matters most, cannot be measured in words or gestures. It is felt deeply, quietly, and undeniably. I see now that life doesn't always call for dramatic confrontations or loud declarations. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones carried out in silence, through calmness, grace, and unwavering presence. The truth has a way of surfacing on its own, often in the quietest of ways. And in that, there is a lesson. Love, patience, and dignity can be more powerful than anger or revenge. They leave a mark that words alone could never achieve. In the end, revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just being there, uninvited, yet unforgettable.